Just thank you so much for inviting the film. I was here apparently 6 years ago, almost on this date today, showing a bunch of other films, and so it's really nice to be back here. This film is the latest feature film that I made. I've been making films with the same actors for about 15 years now, and this is the first time that I make a film with them where the characters are playing actors. So so it's a special film for me. And also all of the actors that I've been working with for many years are in it. And I guess that's it. So I'll be back here afterwards for Q&A. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.
Hello, good evening. Thank you, Nico, for being here, for taking the time. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for sticking around. And of course, if you have questions or remarks, please let us know as soon as possible. Also, because we have already done a conversation about this film a few months ago, so we might have to reinvent ourselves. But then again, I would say repetition and variation are really at the core of your work, so maybe it's pretty fitting. So you mentioned six years ago there was a retrospective of your work here in Brussels, and I remember that it was really it really highlighted the singularity of your work, especially your search for a narrative logic that defies the conventions of the dominant model based on causality, necessity, resolution, a certain notion of character development. And instead you tend to play with variation and digression, with loose ends and false starts. And in this case, and for this film, it seems to me that you're pushing the limits or stretching the limits of narrative even further, in the sense that it comes across as a kind of patchwork of different references and different registers from different cultural universes. And I was wondering if that was really from the outset of your writing, the idea or the challenge to create a kind of patchwork and see how far you could make them make sense.
So perhaps it's not totally transparent, the fact that that's the process of making this film, that it's a kind of collage of different things that I took from various different places. And it was the opposite. It was not so much like the challenge to do that, but it was more like a way to write it. It was kind of more like a method rather than a challenge. It was a way to come up with things. So, and it was very organic. I didn't set out to do it, but I was interested in, first it was about the acting and the sort of people performing other things. And so I thought they should act things that already exist, because that's something that they do all the time, like theater actors. And so they memorize lines that other people have already done elsewhere. So I was, and things that were crossing in my life at the time by chance, perhaps, then had some resonance. So for example, I watched the movie of Bergman, Autumn Sonata, and there is that scene with the mother and the daughter. The whole film is kind of about a mother and a daughter and their tensions, and there is like a very climactic scene in Bergman with the mother and the daughter, and so I liked that text. And then I thought about how that movie operated and tried to condense the idea of that film and use the text of that moment when the daughter says, I can't remember now, but something like about the pains of the daughter, the pains of the mother will become the ailments of the daughter, and so that's not. And then once I decided I'm going to use that text, then I thought it would be nice to use the same framing as well. And so within the screenplay, I had transcribed Bergman's scene, but I had also made notes about the framing, which is pretty particular in the sense that the actresses are kind of further back and then they come forward towards the camera and they're like positioned perfectly to kind of recreate Bergman's framing. And why I would want to do that is a bigger question. But there was something that felt like that framing is very powerful. So I said, okay, I can use it. And at the same time, it's a little bit different because I'm transforming that framing by turning it from a wide shot to a close-up. And then there are several moments like that. There's also like another moment of a film from Cassavetes that within Cassavetes' film you can understand what's happening, but then when I transcribe the dialogue, and I think that happens a lot with improvisation, and I had noticed this, that when someone improvises, because we speak in really weird ways, I guess. We don't speak in complete sentences, and so in Cassavetes' films, it makes sense because everybody's kind of improvising in the same way, but when you extract the dialogue and give it to someone else to interpret, which is what I did in that scene where Luisa shows up, and the scene of the tables when she shows up and she's cropped, and then she sits down, and then she says this text, and it's incomprehensible what she's saying. In Cassavetes' film, it is comprehensible. In my film, it doesn't make any sense. So I like the transformation there, and it also worked because within the idea of the film, I thought because the two of them, like Paco and Luisa, seem to understand, and the other guy is like, what's going on? Like, what did I get myself into? It's almost like I'm in a nightmare fiction of sorts. So anyway, so this idea of making a film as a collage seemed to me. It's not something that I have done this in the past to some degree, not so explicit as in this film, but I think that in a way it's not so strange for a filmmaker to do this because film directors are not, for the most part, writers. Some are, and some are really good, but the majority of us are not great writers, and we think about cinema not from a writing perspective, and also. Our jobs when we make a film is very much kind of just observe. Like it's not doing that much. It's more like, bringing people together. It's kind of obvious, like the actors are doing their thing, the cinematographer are doing the thing, you're just standing there. And in a sense, making a film has to do a lot more with observing than with creating. And so for me, making a film as a collage, like writing a screenplay as a collage makes sense in that sense, that I don't have to start with a blank page like a writer would, but I start with a series of materials that then I just draw from, and they're very distant materials. Some materials come from literature, but some come from maybe political science even. I was reading a book from political science that was really central for this film. Anyway, so like a series of things that seem not connected, like the idea of collage, and then trying to make connections from things that intuitively resonate. I'm not exactly sure at the moment that I'm writing how they resonate, but I feel that there's something that connects these things. So the writing process tends to be, and particularly for this film, was totally this kind of following a certain intuition of how things connect.
And what role do books play in your process? Because books appear in most of your films, but they never serve as the main engine of the story, I would say. In this case, you have the book Fauna, which lends its title to your film. So what kind of function did it have?
I have a strange relationship with literature in general because I can never remember the plot of books. So like when I think of I read several Dostoevsky novels when I was younger. I don't remember what they're about. I remember like moments, and I remember an intensity and a feeling, for example. And it happens to me with lots of things that I like. And then I also remember devices. Like one of my favorite writers is Thomas Bernhardt, and he writes with this sort of like constant digressions. And I love this sort of like this movement that is cyclical and fragmented and moves forward in strange ways. But then when I try to think what was that book about, I cannot remember it so well. So it's something else that captures me from literature that has less to do with plot. And then when I'm writing, I feel like story is the last thing that is on my mind, yet literature is very central. So it's other things that literature does that are not related necessarily to plot that I'm fairly connected to. And I mean, in particular, in this film, the title of the film, Fauna, is from a book of a Uruguayan writer who's not that well known, perhaps outside of Latin America. His name is Mario Lebrero. But he's become he died, and then, you know how that happened. He's dead, and now he's famous. And he wrote a novel called The Luminous Novel that that is basically his everyday diary. He won the Guggenheim grant, and it's the first time in his life he has money, and now he doesn't know what to do with it because he's from Uruguay, and Uruguayans, I mean, you might not know, but in Latin America, the stereotype of the Uruguayan is someone that has never any money and doesn't spend any money, doesn't need any money. And so he has all this money, and he just describes his day-to-day process of doing whatever. And he's an author that I like a lot. And again, like, I don't even remember what Fauna was about, his book called Fauna, but I stole, for example, the idea of the sisters Flora and Fauna is from that book. From a different book, there's a little bit of a private detective who goes to a town and is not sure what he's looking for. So I took some ideas from his, but it is really like a patchwork. And also and then there's a writer that has been, maybe this is less interesting, but there's a writer called Mario Bellatin, who I think is one of the most interesting writers working in Spanish language today, who's been very influential for me. Also, not so much for the stories he tells, even the themes but this has more to do with style and sort of general approach that has, I think at the end of the day, it has to do with the present as opposed to with this idea of, you said, like our causal relations. It's more about observing that the present has a kind of value independent of what comes before and what comes later.
Well, as I said, all your films have different formal stakes or narrative stakes, I would say, but there's one constancy, and that's the actors. You mentioned that you have been working with the same actors for 15 years. And in your films, they're constantly shape-shifting, mutating, transforming, constantly renegotiating their roles and their characters, I would say. And in this case, the muddling of the border between reality and the world of fiction, or the world of role-playing, has a kind of emotional but also comical tone, especially in the core scene, the central scene, the scene in the bar, where you see actually an actor playing a version of himself. Was that one of the scenes that started the whole project, that started the whole film? Was that really the core of your thought at the time?
Yeah, and perhaps actually it started not. I sometimes think that it started as a political gesture, that's the central film, and I wanted to talk about this political thing. But perhaps it was actually more that I was interested in watching an actor act without lines and how bizarre and maybe potentially funny that could be. And several of my films are comedies, I would say, even though it's not comedy where you necessarily laugh, but they're like, in the kind of, there's something lighthearted about the whole thing. And so I liked that gesture of someone being demanded to act and then not having lines, and then what does that look like? Also because perhaps thinking about acting as mainly the idea of acting as a delivering of lines is something also interesting, that many times films that have very little dialogue, people say they're like more silent, even though they're sound. And there is something about, even in the whole system of how actors are paid, if you don't have lines, you're paid less than if you have more lines, which is kind of odd. Because you can act a lot without saying things, but it seems like there is the value of acting comes from the words, and there is something about that I enjoyed. And perhaps one thing I want to say about this idea of working with all the same actors constantly is that by keeping many things constant, like the actors and the possibilities I have with these actors, what I need to reconfigure in every film are formal approaches. So the stories cannot change that much. I mean, there's some relationships between them, but it's always the same people. Many times the relationships are not that different. Like the mother is always the same actress and the father is always the same actor. And the relationship between the three younger people is not that different between the films. So the challenge for me, and it's not a challenge, it's kind of like what the enjoyment for me becomes not coming up with like what are they gonna do now, but it's more how am I gonna frame it now, or what is the formal device that is going to make this film completely different from the rest of the films, even though everything seems the same. And I mean, I think my films are really different one from the next, even though on the surface they seem like I'm making the same film every time.
Let's talk a bit about what you call the political gesture in your film, because maybe it's not clear to the audience, but some of the actors that you're working with also have roles in Narcos or movies and television series that are about Narcos. So in a way, it's also a criticism on the representation that they participate in.
Yeah, I spoke a little bit about this earlier today. I had like some students from film school here. I was talking about this, so you'll hear it again. One of the things that I was interested was that Paco, the guy that acts as the guy who acts in the TV shows, like this Narcos TV show, actually does that for a living, and so he has now a pretty big part in this TV show. And when the TV show came out, and we were talking about it as a group of friends, we were talking about sort of like the responsibility of representation and what does it mean for us to be involved in this sort of universe. And this is not the first thing, like approach to having this conversation. So like Lázaro, the actor that plays Gavino, he has a blog that's quite interesting, and he had written quite a bit about, and he published a little book about the morals of acting, where he writes about the dangers of representation and how and a great deal of this world we understand through representations. So we especially in contemporary world where we're constantly seeing the world mediated by screens, or mainly by screens, I guess. And so we cannot experience that many things, but we'll experience lots of things through the screen. And so those things that we experience through the screen shape the world that we live in, and therefore actors have a very important part in the shaping of the world that we live in, because there's they have a big representation in our understanding of the world. And also the word representation is interesting when we think about it in terms of politics, like political elections, because we live in these representative democracies where we vote for people and then they represent us in parliament or whatever, and we give them our sort of like our vote in order for them to make decisions for us, and the world is shaped in relation to their representing us. And in a way, the idea that we were discussing is that actors are kind of like that. Now, they're not politicians exactly, but the fact that they have this power of like, then they go on the big screen and they influence the way we understand the world, and their actions have very big consequences on this world. At the same time, it was not, I didn't make this film to like troll Paco, like to make fun of him or anything, or like to confront him necessarily. I mean, the main issue was that we're living, these TV shows about Mexican drug dealers are narrating Mexican contemporary culture. It's not like they're making historical recreations of the Mexican Revolution or something. They're speaking about issues that are really fresh today. There are people dying today because of the issues that are being spoken about in these TV shows. But the problem is that the TV shows reduce the conflict to just the battle between the good and the bad people. And the bad people are these narcos. And these narcos are an invention from television, because in reality these narcos are more like puppets of much more powerful people that don't dress with big hats and guns and boots and so on. Like those the famous narcos that, I mean, I don't know if they're famous this side of the world. Like, I don't know if like El Chapo Guzman is someone that you would know who he is, or probably Pablo Escobar is someone that sounds familiar to people. But those people are people that maybe in Colombia was a bit different at some point, because Pablo Escobar was a politician as well, and he became a senator. But in Mexico, all these big narcos are kind of just ranchers that kind of make money, but that are bound by the decisions of politicians, who are actually the ones that hold all the power, and that's why they can bring them in jail and let them go and capture them when they need to, and so they're very convenient people. Anyway, I find it problematic that Netflix is telling our contemporary history to ourselves. Like, we are watching in Netflix explaining us our realities. And then you watch it and my best friend is there, you know? And so it's like, what are we doing? It's a bit crazy. So this film in some ways was a reaction to that as well. So it was like, let's talk about this. Let's somehow, maybe we cannot talk about it super directly, but maybe we can, at least among us ourselves, make a... And in fact, making the film was really difficult for Paco, and it was like a very cathartic, and we had like, there was a lot of crying, and there was a lot of like intensity, and while we made this film. The scene of the bar, he only did it once, and I wanted to do a second take, and he refused, and I was like, okay, let's just go with this one. And because it's not easy to tell someone you're part of this great problem that we're living in, and so on. But the other actor, the main actor of the film, also has participated in things like this. Gavino has done, has been in movies that sort of misrepresent the whole conflict.
And this critical reflection on this cultural imaginary, which is now really part of our imaginary as well, was it also the reason why there's a sense of violence and menace, like as you can feel there's undercurrents throughout the whole film. It is felt, but it never erupts. There's like a promise that is never fulfilled. So you resist a kind of, you resist that promise, perhaps.
Yeah, the original screenplay towards the end delivered some level of this violence, and then I realized it was stupid, and I took it off. And in some ways, there were different things. One is that the actors, if you're from Mexico, you'll realize because of the accent of the actors and so on that they come from Mexico City. And so the first scene is this sort of people from Mexico City driving towards the north. And for many of us from the city, the violence happens there, not here, but you know, over there in the north. So we're also tourists of violence in that sense. So it's not like we are just as foreigners in our own country as many other people if you come from the city. And so the idea of them driving away, and in the first moments of that drive, they say something like, oh, it must be really dangerous here at night. And that's the kind of thing that people automatically, you would think if you're from the city and you go to the north, like everything is menacing because you've been told that the north is dangerous. And so I wanted to create the feeling of someone that comes from Mexico City, spending some time in this place and feeling that at any moment violence is going to erupt, because that's the stage where generally in all the TV shows and movies that we watch, violence happens. And of course the violence is real. So I'm not saying like this violence doesn't exist, because it is real. But I just feel that I'm just so distant from it emotionally. Like I've never lived it, I've never seen it in front of me, so that I felt like maybe there is no need to actually represent it. And whereas the feeling of like we're entering a dangerous zone, I've had many times, and I've traveled a lot in the north for several different films and scoutings that I've done, and I have this constant feeling of dread that something's going to happen, especially when I'm in places that I don't know, and I always feel that it's because I'm not from that place, and that's why. Because I'm unsure, I don't know. It's like when you walk at night in a place that you've never been before. So.
Can we talk a bit about the dynamics that you have with the people that you work with the actors? Because you said that there were lots of debates during the shooting of this film, but you have been working together for 15 years. And how important is that for you, this sense of community?
I mean, I'm very lucky because they maintain a theater group, and so the group stays together not because of the films, but because of the theater. And so they're all the time putting up plays, and they direct the plays, and in fact, for them, for me, they're essential for the films, but for them, the films are a total afterthought. Like they're directors and they're actors in their own place, and they're theater people, and what they love to do is theater, and they're playing my films because we're good friends. But while we shoot the films, they're always rehearsing their plays. Like I say cut, and they go over there and they start, talking about things that have nothing to do with the film, and they're rehearsing other things. But there is something of that is very exciting always to me, because I feel like then we're part of something that is sort of like this kind of creative sort of machinery that is exciting, even though while we make the films, there is never this sense of like we're doing this and it's going to be great, and like this idea that we're all in this together to make this fantastic film is never there, because everybody's just thinking about their individual projects, which is fine which for me is actually exciting in a very different way. Sometimes it feels like I'm all alone there, but there is something great. And then but the nice thing is that when we actually shoot, they are very generous with sort of focusing in what the characters can be, and I don't direct them, so that they just read, they block the scenes themselves, while I put the camera and the lights and so on. They propose a blocking, and then I watch it, and then I modify a few things, but I almost never tell them anything related to their character. It's almost like I just with the father I do, because the father is a terrible actor, and so I have to really take care of him. He's not an actor professionally, he's a biological father of one of the actors, and so he's just there to hang out with his son, who never calls him, and so he's happy to be there just so that he can be with his son. And I like him, he's a very sweet man, but I have to take care of every scene. We even it's too much. Like I say the lines with the tone, and then he repeats, and then I say them again, and then he repeats, and so it's a very like almost puppetry. But the rest of them are the opposite. They just kind of do their thing.
You say you don't direct them, but there is a clear mise en scène in your films, and the mise en scène is oftentimes participates in the different registers that you put in your film. For example, I'm thinking of this bar scene where all of a sudden there's this movement of the camera that opens up, and all of a sudden you feel that you're part of, or that you're watching an episode of Narcos, or perhaps the rehearsal later on, where you have this kind of soap opera language that you adapt. So there is a mise en scène that is clear for you from the start. Yeah, so I do... what I meant is that I don't direct them psychologically. So there is no, about who the character is and things like that. I do... Yeah, I tell them what to move and where to go and things like that. Sometimes they help me with the blocking a bit. I explain them what the scene should be. Like the whole cigarette scene, the fake cigarette scene, for example, I explain them that what the blocking should be, but more not in a practical sense, but like in a general sense, like move back and forth and like in both axes. And they came up with a possible, they knew where the camera was going to be, and they suggested a movement, and then I sort of altered it. Obviously, the one with the one I mentioned earlier with Autumn Sonata one, where the mother and the daughter get really close to the camera, that was like tape on the floor and very. I do a lot. This film has a lot of like very precise sort of movement of actors. So yeah, in practical terms, I do direct like that, but I don't tell them things about. Yeah, like directing in more like what they're feeling and things like that. Maybe we can talk a bit about the economy of your films. I mean, because I know you have been working on at least one big budget film as a hand for hire. And I know that many young filmmakers, perhaps also the ones sitting here, are looking for new ways of making film, not new ways, but alternative ways of making films away from the industry conventions. Do you find that you have found the model that suits you?
Yes, but I don't necessarily think it's what anyone else should be doing. It's just like it's something that works for me quite nicely, and I have a very kind of for me the hardest thing. I have a lot of friends who are filmmakers, and I always sort of I think, why are you suffering so much trying to make this movie? Like, it should be something, it's your life. Like, it should be something that you enjoy. And it's like your fifth movie, and you're still kind of like fighting and yelling at producers on the phone and like having this long emails and trying to raise lots of money to make this thing. But then, like, you know, losing, I mean, I'm also losing my hair, but like worse than me. And like, you know, having a really hard time, you know, like with life, while trying to raise budgets for the films, because obviously, I mean, if you want a lot of money, it's going to be difficult. That's the world we live in. And so it's harder to, but maybe, and then on the other side, like a lot of the films I love cost a lot of money, you know, in the history of cinema. So I also understand, like, yeah, it's great that all those amazing directors have gotten all this amount of money to make those amazing films. For me, it's more like I found a little system. The films are not expensive. I can make a film for practically nothing at this point because I own a camera and I own some lights. The actors are willing to act for free when there's no money, and when there is, I pay them. So the films, I've made films for like $500 and films for like $100,000, and they look the same, because basically in the $500 films I didn't pay anybody, and in the $100,000 I paid really well everybody, but the process and are kind of the same. And there's something just so enjoyable about not having to think about, I mean, very few artists decided, like, I want to do art because I love Excel spreadsheets and finances, and, you know, so it's like, obviously you want to be in a position. So I found this model. It comes with a lot of, you cannot do anything you want, of course. I pre-produce when I write. I censor things that I think are going to be expensive. And I work with things and spaces and people that I think I have access to. But that's just my model. Then, you know, it's not for everyone, I guess.
Maybe some of you have follow-up questions? Okay. Yeah.
In which film?
Sundown, Franco's
Michel Franco?
Yeah.
Sundown.
Is it not called Sundown? Yeah.
He has a film called Sundown?
Yeah.
I didn't know.
Okay, yeah.
I haven't seen that. Sorry. Yeah, but Michel Franco has quite a reputation where I come from.
Okay. No, it's
Anyway.
a film with a lot of problems, I think, but the way violence is introduced in the film is quite peculiar.
I feel that coming from a place that is full of violence, there is a sense of... this is perhaps my first film that I deal with the question of violence. And I was concerned about how do you approach that, and how it's very different approaching violence in an abstract and approaching violence when it's happening, you know, when it's part of what you're living. And I was not willing to engage directly, and maybe that's part of it because I think it's the right thing to do. Part of it is because I'm a bit of a coward in that regard. So, like, I'm not sure, and also I'm not particularly interested in more. As we were walking here, we were talking with Jan about this. Like, there's these two very, I think, much better filmmakers than Michel Franco, Reigadas and Amat Escalante, who are probably the most important Mexican filmmakers right now. And they both deal with really sort of harrowing violence of contemporary Mexico. And while I think actually their movies are not bad, I find that there is a sense of sort of like a lack of tenderness or a lack of care that I find disheartening in their films. And we were talking about Bruno Dumont, and I think that even his early films that have like that sense of, I mean, there's nothing to do, but I find always that there is some care. So there is possibility with like care and tenderness and violence, but somehow the contemporary Mexican films that deal with this sort of impending issue, I'm always a little bit skeptical of. I don't know. I have a hard time with a lot of it. And Michel Franco, I think, is unexcusable. Like most of his work is just like I cannot understand what he's thinking. But there are others that do deal with violence in, I think, more interesting ways. The what, sir? I'm not super happy with this film, with the color, to tell you the truth, because it's a little bit more. I have to spend a bit more time with. That's what you're asking, right? About color? Yeah, I thought it was just in my mind, and then I sort of started. It's a yeah, it's a little bit more washed out than I thought it was when I was color correcting it, and then I thought it was weird that this film is a little bit washed out, and this is kind of like the representation of the North is always a little bit washed out, and I was like, maybe it needs a bit more saturation, but I don't think about it enough. I think now I started to be a little bit more. Some films of mine, I think, look great and the color is right, and some films not so great, and it's not because of decisions I took, but because I was a little bit. It was what it was. And to tell you the truth, for the longest time I was shooting on cameras that had the color sort of predetermined, like there was not much I could move. Like I was shooting on, many of my films were shot on Mini DV, and the contrast and the saturation was kind of built in, and if you tried to move a little bit in post-production, the image fell apart and it started to pixelate. And that's all my first films, and that's how I studied, and that was kind of like how I made films, so I didn't touch it. And now that I started shooting in RAW, like this, I mean, this is very boring technical shit, but when you shoot in this RAW format, it's like this very flat image, and then you can do whatever you want with it. And it's become a little bit of a challenge, I guess. So it's a terrible answer, but really it's because I maybe should put a bit more attention to it. I spent a lot of time doing it with a cinematographer, but there was just not a very concrete idea of what we just look at something and then we would tell the guy, because I got an award to do the color, and so we were like a nice place to do it, and then we'd be like a little to the left, a little, like not knowing exactly what to do, and then it ended up what it is. It's not horrible, I think, but it's also could be a little bit more saturated.
Someone else? Maybe one more question, because there's a companion piece to Fauna, which is called Flora, which will be shown, I think, Saturday. What is the relation in between?
I mean, I think I made it because in the pandemic I was not shooting, and so I was at home with a lot of leftover stuff from Fauna, and because I did more Q&As than I'd ever done in my life for this film, because the film premiered online, because there was all these online festivals, and so every festival, I would get these emails, do you have half an hour in the next 2 months to do a Q&A? Like, how do you say no? Like, no, I have no time in the next 2 months to do a Q&A. So like then every single festival there was a Q&A, and they're all recorded, and at some point, it was just like play, and I would just talk about the same things. And then I realized there was all of these things that I was talking about, which is mainly the political aspect of things, was not really in the film. Like the film, if you haven't spoken to me and you just watch this film, maybe you could sense something, but really the film is a comedy and it's about other things. So I decided to make a little essay film about Flora is like the Q&A for Fauna, in a sense. So I decided to make a little film, and I showed it to some students. So they saw first I don't even know why you came. We could have just, but and so it was nice also to rework material. It's something that now I'm enjoying more. And also I teach at a university, and I find that I ask my students to do a lot of things that I don't generally do, and so now I've started to do, like, there's a film screening in November of a short film I made that's a little homage to Chantal Ackerman called Dear Chantal, which is I think it's screening here. That it's just like a 5-minute. I also showed it to students, but that film I made also because I asked my students to make epistolary film, like a correspondence film, and I had never made one, so it's also nice to make one. And I teach a class on essay filmmaking, and I'd never done one, so it's also kind of good to make some things that I'm teaching. I mean, because you cannot make everything, you know, but like, and I have to teach other things that I'm not the things I do, but it was kind of like a nice. I said, I mean, you teach as well, and when you're teaching, you spend so much time thinking about certain subjects, and so at some point I was like, okay, I've been thinking about essay filmmaking for so long and I've never made one. I'll give it a shot, and the same thing with epistolary film. So,
someone else, or should we? Okay, call it quits. Okay, thank you, Nico.
Thank you so much, Stoffel.
Thank you, all of you.
Thank you so much.
More of Nico's films will be shown Saturday in Cinema Nova at night, and I think in the projection room in the morning. Is that correct?